So welcome back to my video series on RK-CAD training. This is video number 7 where we're going to be talking about using the rotary. Now what is a rotary? A rotary comes in two different styles. It comes in a roller style rotary and a chuck style rotary. And the difference is how you mount the cylinder on it. In a roller rotary, the cylinder sits on a pair of rollers and the rollers move to roll that cylinder around. In a chuck rotary, the item is chucked into the chuck and then it rotates when the chuck rotates. And in this video, we're not going to be concentrating on a roller style rotary because most of the time with a galvo, most galvos come with a chuck style rotary, so that's what we're going to be concentrating on. But you can use a roller style rotary with a galvo laser. A lot depends on what it is you are trying to engrave, whether it works or fits better in a chuck style rotary or a roller style rotary. But what I want to talk about right now is the difference between the way a rotary works in a gantry style laser and the way it works in a galvo laser. So in a gantry laser, the head moves in X across and Y front to back in a flatbed laser. And when you put in a roller or a chuck style rotary, that takes over one of the axes. It typically takes over the Y-axis and the head still moves in X, but it depends on how you position it within the bed. So as the head scans a line and burns a line, then the rotary increments and it scans either backwards or forwards again, depending on how you have it set, and that's how it eventually makes the image on the cylinder. In a galvo, however, we are not just limited to one axis of movement for the laser head because it can move in X and Y along with the rotary able to move in one of those directions. So let's say the rotary is moving in Y, which is front to back, and the head is moving in X. Now you could set it up so that for each scan line, it burns a scan line and then the rotary increments once. But to save time, what they typically do in a galvo system, since the head can scan more than one line, they will scan a batch of lines and then increment the rotary and scan another batch of lines and then increment the rotary. How many it scans at one time is dependent on how you set it and also how finicky your focus is and what it is you're engraving, because if you scan too many lines the opposite direction of the way the rotary is moving, you could lose focus and it wouldn't come out great. So that's the difference between how a rotary works on a gantry style laser versus a galvo style laser. And we'll get into more of that later when we get into the actual settings. Now, since we are engraving on a cylinder, there's some important things you need to know about the object that you're engraving. First of all, you need to know its diameter, and from its diameter you can figure out the radius, which is half the diameter, and you also need to know the circumference. So if you know the diameter, that's pretty easy to figure out. You can just kind of measure across the item and come up with a diameter. Now let's say your diameter is 54 millimeters, and you need to know the circumference for a lot of things. So the way to find that out is to use a circumference calculator, and there are plenty of them on Google. Here is one right now. I just typed in circumference calculator and it came up with this calculator right here, and it works on the radius. So it wants to know the radius. If I put in the radius, it'll calculate the diameter for me, the circumference for me. If you want to calculate it yourself, the formula is 2 pi r, where r is the radius. Pi is 3.141414, etc. All right, so you can calculate it yourself, but you can also use this little formula here. So I said our diameter was 54 millimeters. Half of that is 27, so that's our radius. So I'm going to put in 27, and you see it calculates the circumference at 169.65. So we'll call that, you can either say it's 169 or 170, either one will work, depending on what it is you are engraving. So why do we need to know that? Let's go ahead and close this. And let's go back and look at our engraving area. So when we engrave on a cylinder, we are not limited by the lenses X and Y. We are limited by one of those dimensions. So let's say we're going to rotate the cylinder this way in X, and we're going to engrave in Y, and we are limited to Y whatever our lens is. So in this case I have a 50 millimeter lens selected, so that's the dimension of my viewing area here, my canvas, 50 millimeters this way. But I'm not limited to 50 millimeters this way, so I can put in a much bigger canvas. Now, how big can I go? Well, that's dependent on the circumference. This is why we need to know it. So if I wanted to engrave all the way around, I would need a circumference or a canvas area of 169, let's say. All right, now, to change this viewing area, you can go to the settings and go to the galvanometer check settings, and this is where you would set your canvas appearance size. But notice that it doesn't allow me to set a X and Y size. It assumes that X and Y are the same, which they typically are in a galvo, except when we're using a rotary. So if I change this to 169, I have to change both of them, which will not give me a good setup of where to put my engraving. So we're not going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and close that window. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to make a temporary box that represents our engraving area. So I'm going to make a rectangle. So I'm going to click once, move the mouse, and click again to make an arbitrary size rectangle, at least for right now. I'm going to go back to my normal select mode, and here are the properties for that particular rectangle. And when I select it, you'll see the properties for it. All right, so I want to leave scale lock off for this, and I know my engraving area in Y is 50 millimeters, so I'm going to set that first to 50 millimeters, and then my width is my circumference, so that I'm going to set to 169, and I'm going to apply that. Okay, and I get a much bigger rectangle. Now I want it to be centered on my screen, so to do that I'm going to go back to my home screen. I'm going to go to my centering. I'm going to click 0 align, and that's going to align it. I'm going to zoom out, and you can see that in X this is the largest area that I can put things to go around that 54 millimeter diameter cylinder. So quite a bit bigger than my engraving area. So for now you can ignore this canvas. When you get into 3D engraving, it takes this canvas into account. We'll let you go bigger than the crystal size, but in this instance it will ignore the actual canvas borders for our purposes. So you can fill this up with text or pictures or whatever you want to engrave. You go from edge to edge as long as it will fit on the cylinder. All right, so that is how you would set up your drawing view to start putting things in. Now this is assuming that your chuck is oriented so that it will rotate in the X direction. My chuck on my laser right now is set up to rotate in the Y. So if I wanted to look and see what would go in here, I would go ahead and change this to 50 millimeters wide and 169 millimeters high, and then I'd probably want to arrange everything so it's sideways instead of up and down here. And that's a little hard to design to, so what I would do is just design it this way, and then when I'm completely done, then I would rotate the whole thing 90 degrees, and you'd either rotate it clockwise or counterclockwise. Again, that is dependent on how your chuck is positioned in the laser. So there's no absolute here. You have to take into account which way the chuck is positioned, and then also how the object is positioned in the chuck, because whether it's front to back or back to front. So you should, or I should say top to bottom, bottom to top, instead of front and back. But that's some of the considerations for designing. I'm going to actually delete this because for our test we're going to do something fairly small, so we'll keep it in this 50 millimeter here, and I'm going to click auto zoom again to make it nice and big. So before we get into actually making anything, let's take a look at what we need to do to change our setting from our tower to our rotary. Now this is assuming that your laser has only one set of controls for axis controls, and it either controls the z-axis, which is up and down on the tower, or the rotary. Some lasers come with a switch on the front, which you can see here, and when the switch on this particular laser is in the out position, that controls the tower, and when it's in the in position, it switches over to control the rotary. So you got to make sure you're in the right position when you go to engrave, line things up, etc. But for focusing, you want to be back in the tower mode, because you typically will use the computer to focus, like we've gone over lots of times. All right, so you don't engrave in the rotary here like you would in normal software. Instead, what you need to do is you need to go to a different style of project, much like we do for intercrystal carving. So you're going to click the project icon, and here you have some options, and the one you want is axis stick mark. And they've actually misspelled stick, don't worry about that. And it's going to come up here, and actually here it says axis stitch mark. So which one is right? Probably this one. So what this does is you have to load in a file. It doesn't automatically take the file from here. It brings it in here when you click open. All right, so we're going to create a file. So I'm going to exit out of here. You need to do that first. The other thing you need to do is you need to set up your laser parameters, because that comes in along with the file. All right, so we're just going to do something simple. Let's do some text, and I'm going to leave it. I'm going to actually change it to Arial. Let me see, where is Arial here? There we go, Arial. And I'm going to change this, instead of text, I want to say test. Okay, and I'm going to confirm that, and I'm going to make it bigger. Okay, and I'm going to center it. Let me just center it manually. That's going to be close enough. All right, and I'm going to hatch it. So to hatch it, I need to go back to the home screen with my text selected, click hatch, and I'm going to switch to a standard bidirectional. And the way that you hatch it, this angle is dependent on how you have the chuck oriented in your laser bed. So if the chuck is going to rotate in X and Y, you want your hatch to be, if the chuck is going to rotate in Y, you want the hatching to go the opposite direction. You don't want to hatch in the same direction. You want to hatch in the opposite direction. All right, so right now my laser is set up, my chuck is set up so that it rotates in the Y direction. So that means that, first of all, I need to rotate this text so it's going to appear on the object correctly. But also it means that I need to hatch it this way. Now that is angle 0, which is the default. But if you had your chuck set up so that it was the other direction, you would want to change this to a 90-degree angle for the hatch. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and leave this alone, but you want to set your spacing. That you're going to have to decide what works for you for the particular object that you are engraving, and the lens that you have in there, and other factors. So I'm going to leave it at 0.03 for now. I'm going to click confirm, and that's going to hatch our text for us. All right, now I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. I've already got it selected. I'm going to come up here to my rotate, and I'm going to rotate it clockwise 90 degrees because the head of my chuck is going to be over here, and the bottom of my glass that I'm going to engrave is down here, and I want this to read right side up, so it's going to look like this. All right, so I need to save this project. So to do that, I'm going to come up here to my save icon, and I'm going to click that, and it's going to open up a folder. Now this happens to be my 3D models, and here's a file already on here called Rotary. I'll just save over the top of that because they're both test files, and I'm going to click save. All right, it says it's already there. Yes, I want to replace it. All right, so now I've got my file saved, and once I have that saved, I have to, oh, I forgot, I need to make sure that these are set correctly. So for my laser, I'm going to set 40, and mark speed of 3000 is way too high. But I'm going to, before I start engraving on the glass, I'm going to test it with some masking tape on the glass, and you'll see that in a second. So I'm going to change this to 1000, and I'm going to click apply, and I'm going to save it again. So I'm going to click save, and it saved it over the top. All right, so now everything is set because I've got my laser parameters set, got my speed set, my frequency, my pulse width, everything. So now when I go to projects and I go to axis stitch mark and I open that file, Rotary, click open, and it brings it in here. Now there's some settings I need to do here. So first of all, the important thing is setting up our reference axis. So this is, like I said, it's going to segment this file into various strips of scans so it can engrave them. And it's showing me right here how it's going to do that. And like I said, we want to scan this way, so the strips have to run this way, and it's showing me that the strip that it's going to do is running that way. So that means that this X is set wrong. We need it to be Y. So we click the down arrow and set it to Y, and you can see now it's striping it this way. Now, how big are these strips? It depends on the split size here. So you can change this to whatever you want. I'm going to show you a bit later when we get to marking two different settings. One is the lowest it can go, which is 0.01. So if I type, or 0.1 rather, so if I type in 0.1 here, you can see that it's going to scan it like this. So it's a little hard to see with that small of a split size, but I'm going to change it now to a split size of 1 millimeter, and you can see it's a little bit nicer split. It's easier to see what it's going to do. So I'm going to show you a bit later video that I took of engraving this as a test, and then also on the glass itself, and then later you'll see the two different results setting the bigger split size. Now, why would you want to change it? Well, the smaller the split size, the less chance you're going to have banding in these letters where the edges of the strips line up with each other. If you go to a very small split size, that is minimized. The difference is how long it takes to engrave, because the smaller the split size, the longer it takes. The larger the split size, the shorter it is, and you'll see that dramatically in the videos. Now, the disadvantage, again, of getting a really big split size is your focus, because it's going to do a bunch of lines along the cylinder, and it's not going to move when it does them. So you have to make sure that that split size is not too big to where you lose focus, and then you'll really see the difference between the strips. So let's look at the rest of these here. Roll diameter here, we're going to take care of that somewhere else. I'll show you that in a second, so don't worry about that. Instead, we're going to do split size, and again, you can set this to whatever you want. Normally, you're going to have an axis and a vertical offset of 0. If you want to set these, you can. What the axis offset does is it's going to change where it starts along that cylinder, so you can play with that to get different start points. And the vertical offset is actually going to move it up and down this way. So in this instance, because we're going in this direction, it's actually going to move it horizontally as we're looking at it. It's a little confusing, but that's the difference between these two. This offsets it along the rotary axis. This offsets it along the non-rotary axis. You've got a choice whether you want it to reset the 0 point, which is where it started, pre-marking or after marking. I think after marking makes the most sense. And you probably want to leave it on reset 0 so that it goes back to the beginning when you're done. Okay, you can click light preview and it'll give you an actual engraving preview without the laser on to show you how it's going to go. It's a little hard to see because of the segments. And then when you're ready to mark, you can click marking. So the other thing you need to do before you actually do any marking is you need to change your axis setting. So you can get to that by going back to the main menus as we've looked at many times to change the axis setting, or you can get to it right from here. So let's click to it right from here. And it's the same motion control that we've been using to focus, etc. All of my lights now are red. That's because my laser's off. When your laser's on, you'll see these all green. And what you want to do is you need to change this pulse turn to whatever your manufacturer tells you you want to use for your chuck. So my particular chuck that's in there right now is 1280 or 12-8000. So I'm going to change that to 12800. And then instead of trying to work out the unit pulse, I'm going to click calculate. And we're going to leave it on XY axis rotation. We're not doing anything else. And here's our pulse turn, and here's where we're going to set the diameter of our cylinder. So like I said, our diameter is 54 millimeters, so I'm going to change that to 54, and I'm going to click OK, and it's going to automatically calculate the pulses per millimeter for me that it needs to do to go around and keep everything in the proper orientation and the proper proportions, all right? And so once I've got that set, then I'm going to click either apply or OK, and it's going to change my parameters for me. When I get that set to go, I can go ahead and click mark. So before we get into actual engraving, let's talk about your physical setup. This is a picture of my chuck attached to my laser bed. This is a standard D80 rotary chuck that comes with most Galvo lasers. And you can see I've got it bolted down to the bed so it won't move. That's important. You want to position it so that the object that you're going to engrave, the center of that engraving is roughly centered in the center of the lens, and that's where your red dot is when nothing is moving. So you want to try and set that up correctly to begin with, and that will save a lot of issues. So next you're going to want to figure out how you want to focus the laser, because you're going to have to focus to the top of the cylinder. And if you're using the normal ruler on the side and to the marking on the laser head, then that's going to be difficult once you get the rotary installed, because you'd have to move the rotary usually to figure that out. So if you've made a focus stick, that's the best way to do it. And typically we make focus sticks to go from the bottom of the lens to the top of the object. And that's a great way to focus when you have a rotary. It's really easy. If you don't have one of those or you can't make one, then what I've got on the screen right now, known as a machinist square, is the best way to do it. And you want to get one that's fairly large, like this one's a 200 by 300, and it's graduated in metric, which is important. And you'll want to use this to measure from the base of the unit to the top of the object in the rotary, and you do that by hanging one edge of this over the side and taking a measurement from there to the top, and that gives you one measurement, and from there you can then figure out what you need to be from the marking on the head to the top of the object, and you use the ruler upside down to do that. Just remember that as you are setting everything up, as you're going back and forth between setting up the rotary and focusing, don't forget that you're going to have to keep changing either your switch or your cable to go between the tower mode for focusing and the rotary mode for actually engraving. Next, you'll want to probably make a centering line. I like to do this so I make sure that the axis of my engraving is centered on the cylinder. And the way I do that is I'm just going to make a line here in the drawing window, and I want it to be a nice straight line, and I want it to run in the same direction as my cylinder is, not opposite. So if you remember, my cylinder is positioned this way in my laser, so I'm going to make the line this way. Right, now my engraving is going to go this way, but my line that I'm going to do for centering is going to be here. So in order to do that, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to turn on snap toggle, and I'm going to snap it to the grid. Then I'm going to come over here, and I'm just going to get a line, and I'm going to come right here and click, and come over here and click. I want a nice long line, so I'm going to click there, and then I'm going to escape to get out of that mode, and then I'm going to click the light button to light it up. And you can see I've also put some painter's tape, blue painter's tape, on my glass that I'm going to engrave, and I've got the glass in the chuck. And there's my red line that I just created, and I'm just going to position the chuck and get it lined up so that that line is right at the top center of my engraving, and that's a pretty important place to be. You want it to be lined up like that. And the tape is there so A, we can see the line better, and secondly, so that we can do a test engrave without engraving on our glass yet. So another thing that's very important is once you get your chuck aligned with that laser line that we just made, it's also really important to get your glass or cylinder level with the beam. So you want to get a little bubble level or a digital one, whatever you want, stick it on top of the object and adjust that chuck until the item is level, and that's very important. The other thing is that you want to try and avoid objects that are bulgy, because those are a lot more difficult to engrave as a cylinder versus something that has straight sides. Once you have everything lined up and in focus, you're ready to start engraving. And again, you can do the light preview here. I have no idea what this para position button does. I couldn't get to do anything. But when you're ready to go, just go ahead and click mark, and it will start marking. Now, I have two settings. I've set this up to mark at a split size of 1 and a split size of 0.1. I'm going to show you the 0.1 first, and then I'm going to show you the 1, and you can see the difference. And this is real time, not sped up or anything, and this is going to be engraving on the tape. So here it is engraving on the tape, and this is the 0.1 millimeter strip size. So you can see it's doing just a little bit at a time, and you can see that it makes the strip very, very quickly. It's not very wide, and it takes a lot longer to actually move the glass than it does to engrave the strip. So I'm just going to let it continue to run until the end so you can get an idea of how long it actually takes to do. Now you'll notice as this is running that it's engraving the letters from right to left, so it's kind of engraving them backwards. Really doesn't matter. I mean, you could change your rotation axis around in the settings to make it go the other way. The important thing is to make sure that it comes out facing the right way up and that the text isn't backwards. If you're getting that, then you need to start playing with the axis settings in the axis settings for reversing the direction of motion, etc., and just make sure that when you set up your text file or whatever it is, whatever file it is in the normal drawing, and you save it, that you save it in the correct orientation, and that will help a lot of things as well. Okay, it's almost done here. We're at the end of the first T, and there we go. So you can see it went back to home, and here it is engraving the second letters, and this is with the 1 millimeter split size instead of the 0.1 millimeter split size, and you can see it's going a heck of a lot faster. It's also burning the tape a little more because you've got more time in adjacent areas for that tape to heat up. And you can see it's almost done here, and it's done, and it goes back. So you can see the big difference in time that it takes. So here are the same two engravings repeated, this time without the tape, so we're engraving directly on the glass, and I did change my settings for glass for my particular laser. And you can see that it's basically taken the same amount of time as it did with the other one. And this is the 0.1 millimeter spacing for the strips. And you can see it's going to take a whole heck of a lot longer. So we're just going to let this run because I want you to see what this looks like. And here once again is the second set of letters, this time with the 1 millimeter strip spacing. So here's the final engraved glass with the 1 millimeter spacing on the top and the 0.1 millimeter spacing on the bottom. If you were to look really close, you would see that there are some minor differences between the two, but most people, when they look at this, would never know. So you can change that split size to whatever works for you. I will just caution you that when you are engraving on glass, the difference between a good result and no result at all is very tiny on the focus. And so the bigger the strip size, the more you risk going out of focus at the edges of the strip. So I would not go over 1 millimeter in strip size. Maybe 0.5 millimeter might be a good compromise between 0.1 and 1. So that wraps up this video on using the rotary in RK-CAD.